I want to talk about the math methods that you need to know about on the AP exam. Again, this is a Java quick reference. You're going to get a copy of this when you take the exam. So you don't need to memorize this, but you need to understand what these functions do, what these methods do. So these are the math methods that you need to know about. There's two versions of absolute value. One, you pass it an int, it returns an int. If you pass it a double, it returns a double. Piece of cake. There is math.pow, which of course you pass it a base and an exponent. It returns the result of raising the base to the exponent. And of course there's a square root function. I think it's obvious what that does. And math.random returns a random number between 0 and 1. So let's take a closer look at these. Only 5 that you need to know about. So let me just open up my tester here. And maybe I'll just run this whole thing. Now, again, what I'm saying, there's two versions of absolute value. If you pass it an int, it returns an int. If you pass it a double, it returns a double. So if I run this, you'll see, and maybe I'll just run it and so we can compare to the output. No big deal, pretty obvious. Absolute value returns the absolute value of whatever the number is. I get the positive value, of course. Math.round, now I'm including math.round here because it's not actually part of the AP subset, so technically you're never going to need to use round, but I have seen questions that ask you about rounding using another method for doing so. And in fact, you can round, you get the same effect as rounding, and maybe I'll do that right now. You get the same effect as rounding if you add 0.5 to the number and then cast it. So if I have some number and I add 0.5, now of course when I round 3.7 I'll get 4, but if I add 0.5 I'll get 4.2, and then if I cast it to an integer, that actually has the same effect as rounding. So if I take some number x, add 0.5, I think I'm missing a parenthesis, and then cast it to an integer, it should have the same effect. So I can do that again underneath. Oops, I'm missing my parentheses there. So I can round this guy by adding 0.5 and then casting. And if the number is negative, however, hopefully this will make sense, you can't add 0.5 because that would take me more towards the positive, if that makes sense. So let's think about this here. I want to, obviously when I round this, I'm going to get -4, but if I added 0.5, I get negative 3.2. When I round it, I'd get a -3. So if the value is negative that you're starting with, you're going to have to subtract 0.5 and cast it to an integer. And that has the same effect as rounding. So again, I'm just showing you how you do this because I have seen questions that ask you about how you might be able to round numbers by adding or subtracting 0.5. I think it was a multiple choice question. So if you subtract 0.5 from negatives and then cast it to an integer, it has the same effect as rounding. If you add 0.5 and cast it to an integer, that has the same effect as rounding. So I'll rerun this, and I think you'll see we'll get the same values. 4, 3, -4, -3. Terrific. Math.pow, of course, this is exponents, pretty obvious. I can pass it to doubles. If I pass it in integer, it still treats them as doubles. Math.pow always returns a double. And so here, if you look at the results, I always get a double returned. 8 to the -1, of course, is the same thing as saying 1/8. That's why. Square root, I think, is pretty obvious. And random, we've talked about before. You get a random number between 0 and 1, including 0, but less than 1. So is that what I said? Between 0 and 1, including 0, but less than 1, some decimal number. So let's take a little bit closer look at math.random. And I think I had it just opened here. This turns out to be a pretty important one. You're going to use this quite a bit. Math.random again returns a double. Typically what you will do is you will multiply it by something. So here I'm multiplying math.random by 6. That will expand the range. Now I'll get something between 0 and 6. Still decimal numbers. If I multiply it by 10, obviously I get something between 0 and 10. typically what you will do is cast it to an integer. So here I'm multiplying it by 5, and when I cast it to an integer, it'll truncate, so I will get something from 0 up to 4 inclusive, 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. I always think of it by thinking about like this, whatever you multiply by tells you how many values you're going to get, and of course when you cast it, when you truncate it, it'll start them at 0. If I don't want to start at 0, which typically you don't, you'll have to add something at the end. So here I'm multiplying by 2. This means I get 2 different random numbers, but I'm adding 1, so that means I'm going to start at 1. Here I'm multiplying by 8, so I'm going to end up with 8 different random numbers. Again, I'm adding 1, so I'm going to start at 1. Here I'm going to multiply by 10, so that gives me 10 possible random numbers. And I'm subtracting 4, so my starting value is -4. And it goes from -4 up to 5, which in fact is 10 possible random numbers. So the general pattern is you multiply by something, which tells you how many random numbers you're going to end up with. You cast it to an integer, and then you add a starting value. I know somebody's going to make this error, so I put this example here. You're always going to end up with 1 in this case. Well, why would that happen? Well, that happens because you're missing parentheses, so when you do math.random and then truncate it, that's going to result in a 0 every time. I'm just truncating something between 0 and 1. I'm getting 0. 0 times 6 is 0 plus 1. Oh, I'm always going to end up with 1. So make sure you include the parentheses there. Sometimes you'll want to get a random number in between a range from low to high. So this is just an example of that. How do I get a random number from this starting point up to this ending point, inclusive of them? So of course, if I do high minus low plus 1, that will tell me how many random numbers I have. Don't forget the plus 1, right? If I want the random numbers from 3 to 5, 3, 4, 5, that's 3 random numbers. So when I do 5 minus 3, that only gives me 2, so I have to add 1. And then of course, plus low at the end, that gives me my starting value. And on the back, a couple of super quick things here. Sometimes you want to use random numbers to generate some kind of probability. So here I'm generating a random number, and I'm saying if x is less than 0.4, some event has occurred. I'll have some code in here, otherwise it did not occur. There will be a 40% chance that this line will be true. 60% chance that this line will be true as well. And then a little warning here at the end: be careful not to regenerate random numbers inside an else if statement. This is not going to do what you hope that it's going to do. I hope that makes sense. You really want to generate your random number and then test to see if it's within some range in these if then else's, like I did in the example above. The problem here is that perhaps you want this top thing to happen 1/3 of the time, and this to happen 1/3 of the time, else this bottom thing to happen 1/3 of the time, but that won't happen because you're regenerating a random number in here. Just a little warning. All right, anyway, that was random numbers real quick, and hopefully that makes sense, and really math methods aren't too bad. So there you go.